terrify myself into not falling asleep last night, I was watching Glenn Beck on on Fox News, and he made it clear that he didn't want to live in France and he didn't want America to become France. But you're actually working with the president of France, aren't you, to rethink economic measurement, I guess, how we actually measure whether a country is doing well. And we have a question here which is related to that. Given that the economics of an era are a product of the values of that era, do we need a different value system to drive the economics of the future? And I guess, how does that relate to the happiness measures and the quality of life numbers that you're trying to put into the national statistics?
Well, there are many aspects of this. Let me go back and talk about a little bit what this was an International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. It reflects a fundamental point that what we measure affects what we do. If we measure the wrong things, we'll do the wrong thing. If what we measure doesn't reflect our values, what we think is important, we'll be doing the wrong things. So there have been a lot of a recognition that our system of GDP doesn't really reflect, in many ways, is not a good measure of economic performance. Let me just give you a couple examples that were brought out by the crisis. GDP in the years before the crisis looked in the U.S. like it was doing very well. But 40% of the profits, as I mentioned before, were in the financial sector. But those profits were just a made-up number. They were just mythical. A large fraction of the investment was in real estate, all based on bubble prices. Again, not an accurate reflection. What we were doing was not sustainable. That wasn't captured in the statistics. While GDP per capita was going up, most Americans were getting worse off. Is that a good system? If most people are worse off year after year, even if GDP per capita is going up. So what we thought it's important at least to open up the discussion and say, are our statistics really capturing what we think is important? So let me just give you a couple examples of the ways in which our system doesn't really reflect, I think, a good measure of performance. The United States spends 16, perhaps even more, % of GDP on healthcare, and yet health outcomes are lower than in France, which spends only about 11%. Well, that extra spending, to a large extent, is inefficient, but it increases our GDP. And about a third of the difference between France's GDP per capita and the U.S. is simply will disappear once you make that adjustment for healthcare. I'll give you another example. One of the things in which the United States excels is that we have a much larger fraction of our population in prison than any other country, than any of the other advanced industrial countries, about 10 times as much per capita. That does create a lot of GDP because we have to spend a lot of money on prisons, prison guards. It's good for GDP, but I don't think it really reflects an improvement in the welfare, particularly those in prison.
So that may reflect the welfare of all the rest of us, I guess, depending on what they did.
But
yeah.
the point I make is that there are lots of aspects of GDP that really don't reflect how well a society is performing. And what we did is to go through and delineate all the kinds of reforms that need to be done.